The first time Captain Daniel Cade saw Zyra of Orthis 9, he assumed she was carved from ice. She stood alone in the observation deck of the U.S. Vanguard, a silent specter against the swirling nebula outside. Her silver-blue skin reflected the cold starlight, her crimson eyes unblinking as she surveyed the void. She barely acknowledged his presence when he approached. "Ambassador Zyra, I'm Captain Cade. I'll be handling your security during your stay on the Vanguard." She turned her head slightly, her gaze sweeping over him like a machine analyzing data. "Unnecessary," she said, her voice smooth and detached. "With all due respect, Ambassador, the United Earth Council disagrees. After the assassination attempt on the last Orathian envoy, human paranoia." Her words were dismissive, but there was something deeper behind them, something he couldn't quite place. "I still have my orders," he said, keeping his tone level, "and I take them seriously." She exhaled softly, almost in annoyance. "Very well. Do as you wish, Captain Cade. Just do not interfere with my mission." Dan resisted the urge to sigh. He had dealt with difficult diplomats before, but Zyra was in a league of her own. The Arathians were a mysterious race, advanced, enigmatic, and largely indifferent to human emotions. They claimed to feel nothing. Zyra, in particular, was rumored to be one of their most ruthless negotiators, a cold strategist who never wavered. Dan wasn't looking forward to babysitting an alien ice queen. But then, things never went as planned. 3 days into the voyage, trouble came knocking. Dan had stationed himself outside Zyra's quarters when the first alarm blared through the Vanguard's corridors. "Unauthorized vessel detected," the comms officer's voice crackled over his earpiece. "It's cloaked, appearing and disappearing off our sensors." "Source?" Dan barked, "Already moving. Unknown, but it's closing fast." Dan rushed toward the bridge, but before he could get far, Zyra stepped out of her quarters. "It is the Varii," she said. Dan stopped in his tracks. "You know that how?" "Because they have come for me." The way she said it sent a chill down his spine. "Captain, we have a problem," another voice cut in. "Lieutenant Carson, his second in command. They just bypassed our shields like they weren't even there. They're boarding us." Dan's gut twisted. "How many?" A pause. "Too many." He drew his sidearm. "Ambassador, stay close. We're getting you to safety." Zyra's expression didn't change. "There is no safety," she murmured. Then the lights flickered, and the screams began. The corridors of the Vanguard became a war zone. Dan and his squad moved fast, but the Varii moved faster. They were shadows given form, flickering in and out of visibility, their curved blades slicing through armor like paper. "Fall back! Fall back!" Dan shouted, firing his pulse rifle down the hallway as one of the creatures lunged. It twisted in the air, phasing in and out of sight, and then Zyra moved. She stepped forward, raising her hand. The air shimmered. The Varii froze mid-motion, its form distorting as if trapped between dimensions. Then it disintegrated. Dan turned to Zyra, stunned. "What the hell was that?" She didn't answer. Her crimson eyes burned with an intensity he'd never seen before. "Captain," she said, her voice lower now, more human somehow, "if we do not leave this ship immediately, we will not survive." Dan clenched his jaw. "And how do you propose we do that?" Her expression was unreadable. "I will show you my true face." The remaining crew regrouped in the central hangar, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Dan was bleeding, his pulse rifle nearly drained. Carson was panting beside him, gripping his wounded arm. "We're not gonna make it," Carson muttered. Dan knew he was right. The Varii had them surrounded. The ship was failing. This was the end. Then Zyra stepped forward. She raised both hands. Her skin shimmered, and for the first time, Dan saw. She wasn't just an Orathian. She was something else. Her silver-blue form cracked apart, revealing swirling, cosmic energy beneath. Stars burned inside her. The Vanguard trembled as the laws of physics warped around her. The Varii screamed, and then reality shattered. Dan barely had time to process what he was seeing. Zyra was no longer the cold, emotionless diplomat he had assumed her to be. She was something more, something ancient, something powerful. The Vanguard's walls trembled as the Varii shrieked, their semi-physical forms contorting as if caught in an invisible current. Zyra's presence distorted the very fabric of space around her. "What are you?" Dan whispered, pulse hammering. Zyra turned her burning crimson eyes toward him, and for the first time, there was something there, something alive. "I am a Wraithian," she said, "but not as you know them." She lifted a hand, and the space around them bent. The Varii, who had once seemed invincible, now writhed in agony. One by one, they were being pulled apart, not with violence, but with an eerie, silent unraveling, as if they were threads of reality being unwoven. Dan felt a pressure building in his skull, a gravitational pull toward her. He fought the urge to collapse. "Zyra, stop. You're killing us too." She turned sharply, and for a fraction of a second, he saw hesitation. Fear? No. Something deeper. Then she clenched her fists, and the energy swirling around her contracted. The suffocating pull lessened. The Varii, now weak and distorted, screeched in retreat. Their forms flickered, vanishing one by one until the ship was silent once more. Dan staggered, gripping the nearest railing. Carson coughed beside him, his face pale. What the hell just happened? Zyra stood still, breathing deeply, as if suppressing something immense. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before. "They will return." Dan forced himself to stand upright, adrenaline still pounding in his veins. "Then we need to get off this ship?" Zyra hesitated. "You misunderstand, Captain." Her glowing red eyes met his. "There is nowhere to run." Dan's mind was still reeling, but he didn't have time to process it. The ship's automated systems blared over the speakers. "Warning. Critical damage sustained. Hull integrity failing." He looked to Zyra. "Can you get us out of here?" She studied him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she reached for him. Her fingers, cold and smooth, pressed against his forehead. And suddenly, Dan saw, not in the way he was used to. His vision expanded. His mind stretched into something beyond comprehension. He saw her. Not just Zyra, but everything she was. She was not simply a Wraithian. She was exalted. A being born from the remnants of a long-forgotten war between dimensions. Her kind were not mere diplomats, but custodians of something vast and terrible. She had hidden her true nature because humans could not understand it. Because if they did, they would fear her. She pulled her hand away, and Dan gasped as reality snapped back into place. He stumbled, gripping his head. Zyra studied him carefully. "Now you understand." Dan exhaled sharply. "I don't know what I understand, but I do know we need to get the hell off this ship." Zyra nodded. "Follow me." With the ship in chaos, they raced toward the emergency hangar. Carson, still limping, muttered, "This is insane. What's the plan?" Dan had no answer, but Zyra did. "We are not escaping." Dan narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me?" Zyra placed a hand on the hangar's control panel. The room shifted, the metal darkened, the air vibrated with unseen forces. Then, before their eyes, a rift opened in the center of the hangar. A tear in reality itself. Through it, Dan could see another place. It was not space as he knew it. It was alive. Stars twisted in impossible patterns. Shadows moved without light. And somewhere in the distance, something was watching. Dan swallowed. "What is that?" Zyra stepped forward. "The only place they will not follow." Carson looked between her and the rift. "You want us to jump into that?" Zyra met Dan's gaze. "You do not have a choice." The ship groaned behind them. The Varii were returning. Dan clenched his jaw. He had always been a soldier, a man of logic. He followed orders, stuck to the mission. This was madness. But somehow, looking at Zyra, at the way she stood, waiting, watching, no longer the cold, distant diplomat, but something far more real, he made his decision. "Carson," he said, "we're going in." Carson swore. "I hate this job." And then, they stepped into the void. Stepping into the rift was like plunging into the heart of a collapsing star. Dan felt himself stretching and folding, as if his body no longer obeyed the laws of physics. His breath caught in his throat. Except there was no throat, no lungs, no body at all. He was falling, rising, existing in 1,000 places at once. And then, he landed. The sensation was sudden, jarring, as if he had been thrown back into his physical form. His boots struck solid ground, or something that felt solid. He gasped, dragging in a breath that tasted electric. Carson hit the ground beside him with a sharp curse, groaning as he rolled onto his back. Dan forced himself upright. His head pounded, his vision swimming, but when it cleared, his breath caught in his chest. The place they had entered was not space. It was a realm of shifting geometry, an impossible landscape where the sky bent in fractals of light and darkness. Mountains floated, unanchored, twisting in slow, deliberate spirals. Vast rivers of liquid shadow pulsed with unnatural currents, whispering sounds he didn't understand. Stars burned in the distance, but they did not stay still. They moved, slithering across the void like living things. And in the center of it all stood Zyra, or what was left of her disguise. She no longer looked entirely Orathian. Her silver-blue skin now rippled with streaks of dark energy, her form unstable, almost translucent at the edges. The once contained glow in her crimson eyes now blazed freely, burning like twin stars. Dan swallowed hard. Where the hell are we? Zyra turned to face him. We are in the threshold, a place between dimensions. Carson let out a shaky breath, still lying flat on the ground. Great. We escaped a haunted warship only to end up in some kind of... I don't even know what this is. Space hell? Dan ignored him. His instincts screamed that they were not safe here. You said this was the only place the Varii wouldn't follow? Zyra nodded. Yes. Dan frowned. Why? She was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, she said, because something far worse dwells here. The words sent a chill down Dan's spine. Carson sat up, rubbing his face. That's it. I officially hate this mission. Dan shot Zyra a sharp look. You brought us here, and now you're telling us we just walked into something worse? Zyra exhaled slowly. The threshold is the place of exile. The Varii dare not enter because their kind was once hunted here. Dan's fingers tightened around his rifle. By what? A sudden tremor ran through the ground beneath them. The shadows along the horizon shifted. Something was waking up. Dan raised his weapon instinctively, though he had no idea what he was even aiming at. Zyra, however, remained still. Lower your weapon, she said softly. Dan hesitated. Why? Because it won't help you. The shadows moved, rising in great columns, twisting like serpents. The whispering currents grew louder, taking on the cadence of voices, countless voices speaking at once. Some murmured in tongues Dan didn't recognize. Others whispered in his own voice, repeating thoughts he hadn't spoken aloud. His pulse pounded in his ears. A shape began to form in the darkness. It was vast, unfathomably vast. Not a single entity, but a mass, a shifting, writhing presence that had no definite form. It bent space around it, warping reality in its wake. Dan had seen many horrors in his years of service, but nothing like this. It was looking at him, not with eyes. There were no eyes. But he felt its attention settle on him, pressing against his mind like an ocean tide, heavy and crushing. Something inside him whispered. Dan gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay upright. He didn't know how, but he knew. If he obeyed, if he submitted, he would never stand again. Carson let out a strangled noise beside him. What the hell is it saying? I can hear it in my head. Dan turned to Zyra. What is that thing? She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was barely a whisper. The Watcher. Dan's stomach tightened. And what does it want? Zyra's crimson eyes glowed brighter. It wants to decide whether we are allowed to leave. The entity loomed over them, its shifting form stretching into the sky. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single, cohesive voice. Deep, ancient, resonating through every cell in Dan's body. Who dares trespass upon the threshold? Zyra stepped forward. I am Zyra of the Exalted. The air rippled. The presence pressed in closer, its mass warping the very space around it. You are known. Dan exchanged a glance with Carson, his grip tightening on his rifle. If Zyra had been here before, then what the hell had she not told them? The Watcher's voice rumbled through the void. And the others? Dan took a deep breath. Captain Daniel Cade, United Earth Navy. Carson, still looking half ready to vomit, muttered, Lieutenant James Carson, and I'd really like to wake up from this nightmare now. For a long moment, there was silence. Then the Watcher laughed. It was not laughter in any human sense. There was no sound, only the sensation of space itself trembling, the universe shuddering in response. Fascinating, it murmured. 2 mortals, 1 fallen exile, and yet you seek passage. Dan's jaw tightened. We didn't exactly have a choice. The shadows coiled and stretched. There is always a choice. Zyra straightened. We seek no conflict. The Watcher shifted, its attention boring into her. You lie. The word rang through the air like a thunderclap. Dan's knees nearly buckled. The Watcher's presence loomed closer, its vastness pressing into their minds. A debt is owed. Zyra's fist clenched. There is no debt. You are wrong. Dan swallowed. What debt? The Watcher did not answer him. Instead, it spoke directly to Zyra. You hid from us. You thought yourself beyond our gaze. But none escaped the Watcher. The darkness coiled around them, stretching closer. And now, Zyra of the Exalted, you must pay what is due. Zyra's expression did not change. But Dan saw it. The flicker of something in her crimson eyes. Dan had never seen Zyra afraid before. She had faced down the Varii without flinching. She had walked into an impossible realm without hesitation. But now, standing before the Watcher, an entity that seemed less like a creature and more like a force, she looked cornered. His gut twisted. What debt? He repeated, stepping forward despite the crushing weight pressing against him. The Watcher ignored him. Its presence swirled around Zyra like a noose tightening, the whispering voices growing sharper. You trespassed upon the forbidden vaults. You took what was not yours. And then you fled. Zyra's lips parted, as if to argue, but she did not deny it. Carson let out a breath. Oh great, she's a fugitive. We've been babysitting an interdimensional criminal this whole time? Zyra shot him a glare, but Dan kept his focus on the Watcher. If she stole something, then what do you want? Payment? Blood? What's the price? The vastness of the Watcher loomed closer, warping the air between them. We do not bargain. The price was set the moment she ran. Dan's stomach clenched. Carson frowned. And that price is? The whispers grew into a single, deafening word. Return. Zyra's entire body tensed. No. The Watcher rippled. You do not choose. Dan's hand instinctively tightened on his rifle. He wasn't even sure if a weapon would work on something like this, but the urge to protect Zyra was immediate, visceral. Zyra turned to face him, her gaze sharp. Stay out of this, Captain. Dan narrowed his eyes. Not happening. Zyra's expression darkened. You don't understand. I understand enough, he cut in. You didn't just bring us here to escape the Varii. You brought us here because you had nowhere else to go. Because this thing was already hunting you. Silence stretched between them. The Watcher pulsed. Time is irrelevant. The debt remains. Zyra took a slow breath. Then, for the first time, she bowed her head. Then judge me, she said quietly. The void seemed to breathe. Then the Watcher lunged. Dan had no time to react. One moment, Zyra was standing beside him. The next, the Watcher's shadowy mass engulfed her. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She simply vanished. Dan's stomach dropped. Zyra! Carson swore. What the hell just happened? Dan didn't think. He moved. His body acted on instinct, his military training overriding every sane thought. He lunged forward, reaching into the swirling darkness where Zyra had disappeared. The moment his fingers breached the threshold, pain, 1,000 voices tore through his skull. His mind stretched, unraveling, as if something was peeling him apart. He saw flashes of things that were not his memories, endless corridors filled with golden light, figures kneeling in silent reverence, a woman standing before an altar of burning stars, and then, deeper still, a cell, a prison without walls, and Zyra, bound. Something ancient coiled around her, unseen chains lashing through her translucent form. She knelt on a shifting surface of liquid darkness, her eyes dimmed, her body flickering between states. The Watcher's voice thundered through the void. "You would reach for what is not yours?" Dan gritted his teeth, his skull splitting from the sheer weight of its presence. "She's not a damn object," he growled. "She's my responsibility." Silence. Then, laughter, dark and vast and endless. "Then let us see if you are worthy of that burden." Dan's world fractured. He was no longer on the shifting plane of the threshold. He stood somewhere else, somewhere wrong. It looked like the Vanguard, but the corridors were twisted, stretching in impossible directions. The walls pulsed, breathing. The overhead lights flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows that didn't match the figures that moved beneath them. Carson was gone. Zyra was gone. Dan turned sharply, raising his rifle. "What the hell is this?" A voice whispered in his ear. "A test." Then the shadows moved. Something surged toward him from the darkness, fast, unnatural. Dan barely had time to react. He fired, but the pulse rounds passed through the figure as if it wasn't solid. Then it was on him. A searing pain tore through his ribs as an unseen force slammed into him, sending him crashing against the warped corridor wall. Dan gasped, forcing himself up, but his body felt heavier, slower. The shadows whispered again. "You cannot save her." Dan clenched his teeth. "Watch me." The darkness laughed. Then the corridor collapsed around him, and Dan fell. Dan hit the ground hard. Or at least, he thought it was the ground. The surface beneath him shifted, as if made of liquid and stone at the same time, solid yet unsteady. He groaned, pushing himself up, pulse pounding in his ears. The air smelled wrong, stale, metallic, ancient. He scanned his surroundings. The warped corridors of the Vanguard were gone. In their place stretched an impossible landscape, a labyrinth of towering monoliths, carved with symbols that twisted the longer he looked at them. The sky above was an expanse of swirling darkness, punctuated by distant, flickering stars that seemed alive, watching. Dan exhaled sharply, gripping his rifle. "Carson," he called. His voice echoed strangely, distorting as if spoken through water. No response. He wasn't surprised. This was the test. The Watcher had ripped him from reality, thrown him into some twisted trial to see if he was worthy of Zyra. And Dan had no intention of failing. The shadows shifted. He turned sharply, rifle raised. Something moved between the monoliths. A flickering shape, just beyond his vision. Dan narrowed his eyes. "Show yourself." The figure stepped forward. Dan's breath caught. It was him. A mirror image. But not quite. This other version of him looked wrong. Its uniform was torn and scorched, blood smeared across its face. Its eyes, his own eyes, were darkened, empty pits of blackness. And when it spoke, its voice was layered, as if 1,000 different versions of himself spoke at once. "You don't belong here." Dan steadied his grip on his rifle. "No kidding." The thing tilted its head. "You think you're here to save her?" Dan didn't answer. The thing smirked. "You can't." Then it lunged. Dan barely had time to react. His other self moved fast, too fast. Shadows curled around its limbs as it struck. An open-palmed blow that sent Dan staggering backward. Pain flared in his ribs. Dan gritted his teeth and fired. The pulse round struck the doppelganger square in the chest, only for it to phase through as if hitting smoke. The thing laughed. "You don't even understand where you are, do you?" Dan rolled to the side as the doppelganger struck again, barely dodging the next attack. "Enlighten me." His counterpart grinned. "This is where the Watcher strips you down to your core." It moved again, fast, too close. Dan barely managed to block as it grabbed his wrist and twisted. Pain flared up his arm. "You've spent your life pretending to be in control," the doppelganger whispered. "Taking orders, following rules. But here, there are no rules." Dan growled and forced his weight forward, twisting his opponent's arm in return and shoving it back. The doppelganger stumbled, but it didn't look surprised. It looked amused. Dan didn't hesitate. He lunged, aiming a brutal punch at its head, and his fist passed through. His balance faltered, just enough for the doppelganger to strike. A heavy force crashed into Dan's chest, sending him flying backward. He hit the ground with a thud, vision flashing white-hot from the impact. The doppelganger loomed over him. "You don't win this by fighting," it whispered. "You win this by understanding." Dan coughed, gripping his ribs. "Understanding what?" The doppelganger crouched down, grinning. "That Zyra doesn't need you." Dan stiffened. The doppelganger chuckled. "She's lived for centuries. She's played games with entities far beyond your comprehension. And you think you, a mere human, can save her?" Dan clenched his jaw. "I don't need to be some cosmic god to help her." The doppelganger smirked. "Then prove it." And then, it vanished. Dan sucked in a breath, forcing himself up. The labyrinth was silent again. But something felt different. The monoliths around him had shifted. The whispering air had stilled. And ahead, through the towering structures, he saw something new. A door. Massive, black, pulsing with energy. And beyond it, Zyra. She was still kneeling, still bound in those unseen chains, her form flickering like a ghost caught between two states. Dan moved. His body felt heavier with every step, the air thick like tar. The closer he got, the more the weight pressed down. But he pushed forward. He reached the door. And as he did, the Watcher's voice rumbled through the void. "You cannot break the chains." Dan's fists clenched. "Watch me." He reached out, and the moment his fingers touched the black surface, the world shattered. Dan gasped as he snapped back into reality. He was no longer in the labyrinth, no longer in the shifting void of the Watcher's realm. He was in a throne room, massive, dark, and before him, Zyra. She was standing now, whole, unbound. Her crimson eyes glowed, her form radiating an aura of cosmic power. Dan's breath hitched. She wasn't herself anymore. She had ascended, and at the far end of the chamber, the Watcher loomed, silent, waiting. Zyra turned to him, her gaze unreadable. "You did not break the chains," she murmured. "You took them." Dan looked down, and his blood ran cold. Wrapped around his own wrists, unseen moments ago, were the same chains that had bound Zyra. Only now, they were bound to him. The Watcher's voice resonated through the chamber. "A debt must always be paid." Dan's heart pounded. He looked to Zyra. Her expression was torn, something caught between gratitude and horror. You took my place," she whispered. Dan exhaled, a dry chuckle escaping his lips. "Great. So what does that mean?" Zyra swallowed. "It means you don't leave." Dan's stomach twisted. "What?" The Watcher's presence curled around him, the whispers intensifying. "You chose. You proved your worth. Now, you must stay." The truth sank in like a lead weight. He had freed Zyra, but in doing so, he had become the prisoner instead. Dan clenched his fists. "No, no way." Zyra stepped toward him, her expression stricken. "I never wanted this," she said quietly. Dan forced a smirk. "Well, it's a little late now." A long silence stretched between them. Then Zyra turned to the Watcher, and her eyes burned. "No," she said. Dan blinked. Zyra took another step forward. "I refuse this exchange." The Watcher's presence rippled. "The choice is made." Zyra narrowed her eyes. "Then we make a new one." The shadows twisted. The whispers grew into a roar. Dan watched as Zyra lifted her hands, power crackling around her fingers. And for the first time, the Watcher hesitated. Dan had never seen the Watcher hesitate before. The entity that had loomed over them like an omnipotent force, beyond reason or mercy, now wavered, its massive shifting form rippling with something uncertain. Zyra stood before it, radiant and defiant, her newly restored power crackling around her like a storm barely restrained. Dan could still feel the weight of the unseen chains wrapped around his wrists, the price he had unknowingly taken upon himself to free her. But now, as he watched her stand against the Watcher, a single thought echoed through his mind. She's not going to let this happen. The Watcher's voice thundered through the void, deep and resonant, shaking the very foundation of the chamber. You presume to challenge the balance? You, an exile, an oathbreaker, now restored. Do you think yourself above the law of the threshold? Zyra's crimson eyes flared. I do not challenge balance, she said coldly. I challenge you. The entity pulsed, shadows twisting like a living vortex. Then you are a fool. The room collapsed around them. Dan barely had time to move before the darkness surged forward, an unstoppable wave of sheer force. Zyra reacted instantly. She raised her hands, and a barrier of shimmering light erupted in front of them, slamming against the incoming tide of shadows. The impact sent shockwaves through the chamber, forcing Dan to his knees. The Watcher pressed forward, its form expanding, the whispers turning into a roar. Zyra gritted her teeth. Dan could see the strain. She was powerful, but this was a battle against something ancient, something beyond mortal comprehension. And yet, she wasn't losing. Dan forced himself upright, ignoring the crushing weight of the chains still binding him. He had no powers, no godlike energy to summon, but he wasn't about to stand by and let her fight alone. Tell me how to help, he said, stepping beside her. Zyra didn't look at him. You already have. Before he could ask what she meant, she threw her hands outward and struck back. The chamber exploded with energy. The shadows reeled, the Watcher's form fracturing. For the first time, Dan felt something he never expected from the entity. The Watcher shrank back, its form pulsing erratically. Zyra advanced. You have no right to dictate my fate, she said, voice steady, unwavering. Nor his. Dan watched, breathless, as the chains around his wrists flickered, their hold weakening. But the Watcher was not defeated. Not yet. The shadows steadied, coiling inward, reshaping. And then, the Watcher spoke. Not in a voice of anger, but one of something far more unsettling. Amusement. Fascinating. Zyra didn't lower her stance, but Dan saw her shift slightly wary. The Watcher's form stilled, its presence no longer bearing down upon them with suffocating force. It has been eons since one of the exalted dared defy me, it mused. Even longer since a mortal survived the trial. Dan clenched his jaw. So what now? You going to let us go? The Watcher pulsed, shadows curling around the room. Perhaps. Zyra narrowed her eyes. No more riddles. The entity exhaled, or at least, it felt like an exhalation, a wave of shifting space distorting reality itself. The debt must always be paid, but payment need not come in the form of chains. Dan stiffened. What does that mean? The Watcher's attention fixed on him. You are an anomaly, Captain Daniel Cade. Dan frowned. Yeah, I get that a lot. You walked into the dark when you could have fled. You took on a burden not meant for you. You have no power, no divine spark, no lineage of the ancients. And yet, you remain. The shadows pulsed again. I would make an offer. Dan felt Zyra tense beside him. He exhaled slowly. Let's hear it. The Watcher shifted, its form momentarily flickering, as if considering its own words carefully. Your chains can be removed. The debt settled. You may return to your world, unchanged. Dan narrowed his eyes. And the catch? The shadows loomed closer. Zyra stays. Silence. Dan's stomach dropped. Zyra went rigid. No. The Watcher ignored her, its dark presence focused solely on Dan. You were never meant to be part of this. This war, this balance, it is beyond you. Release the burden, and I shall return you to your world. Zyra turned sharply. Dan, don't. But Dan wasn't listening to her. He was thinking. Hard. The Watcher was offering him a way out. A clean slate. He could be back on the Vanguard in an instant, breathing normal air, walking normal floors. No more cosmic horrors. No more impossible trials. But Zyra, she would be left behind. Alone. He looked at her. Really looked. At the way she stood tall, unyielding, despite the weight of everything pressing down on her. At the way her crimson eyes burned with defiance, but beneath it, deep beneath it, there was something else. Something human. something that told him she didn't want to be alone. Dan turned back to the Watcher, and he smirked. "Keep your damn deal." The Watcher stilled. "You refuse?" Dan exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "You said it yourself. I wasn't meant to be part of this." He lifted his wrists, showing the lingering chains. "But here I am." He took a step forward, standing beside Zyra. "She's not staying," he said. "And neither am I." For a long, tense moment, the shadows remained utterly still. Then, the Watcher laughed, a deep, rolling sound that reverberated through the void. "Very well." Dan barely had time to react before the chains on his wrists shattered. Light engulfed him, a force pulling him forward, reality itself ripping apart. And then, everything collapsed. Dan woke up to the sound of alarms. His eyes snapped open. He was back on the Vanguard, lying on the cold metal floor of the emergency hangar. The ship systems were flickering online, red warning lights flashing across the consoles. Carson groaned beside him. "Ugh, tell me that was all just some horrible nightmare." Dan sat up. His head was spinning, but he forced himself to look around, and then he saw her. Zyra was kneeling nearby, blinking as if adjusting to being here, to being free. She turned to him, crimson eyes locking onto his. For the first time since he had met her, she looked unsure. Dan smirked. "Guess we made it." Zyra stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she smiled. Dan pushed himself to his feet, his muscles aching like he had just run through hell. Given what had just happened, that wasn't far from the truth. The Vanguard's emergency hangar was still in disarray, flickering lights casting jagged shadows across the walls. The ship groaned beneath them, the aftermath of whatever cosmic storm they had just survived. Carson was still on the floor, rubbing his temples. "Okay, I officially hate everything about today," he muttered. "Did we actually just fight a goddamn extra-dimensional deity?" Dan exhaled. "Yeah, looks like it." His gaze shifted to Zyra. She was still kneeling, her silver-blue skin glowing faintly under the emergency lighting. She looked different, not in the way she had during her transformation in the threshold. There were no burning eyes or shifting energy, but there was something human about her now, something less distant, less detached. She met his gaze. "You should not have done that," she murmured. Dan raised an eyebrow. "Which part? Jumping into the void? Fighting my own shadow? Telling an ancient eldritch horror to go screw itself?" Zyra exhaled, her expression unreadable. "All of it." Dan smirked. "Well, too bad. Because I'd do it again." Something flickered in her eyes. Something he hadn't seen before. Something like uncertainty. Before she could reply, the ship's comm system crackled to life. "This is Command. U.S. Vanguard. Respond. What the hell is going on over there?" Dan sighed, tapping his communicator. "Long story, Command. But we're alive. We lost all sensor readings for nearly 20 minutes. What happened?" Dan glanced at Zyra, still figuring that out. A pause. "Do you require extraction?" Dan thought about that. He looked at the emergency hangar, at the flickering consoles, at the Vanguard's fractured systems barely clinging to life. He looked at Carson, still rubbing his head and mumbling about needing a drink. And finally, he looked at Zyra, an interdimensional exile who had just defied an ancient cosmic force to keep them alive. "No," he said. "We're staying put." "Copy that. Stand by for further instructions." The comms cut off. Dan sighed, running a hand through his hair. His mind was still reeling, trying to process everything. The Watcher, the threshold, the fact that he had willingly thrown himself into hell and somehow walked out. And Zyra, she was watching him again. Dan crossed his arms. "All right, so what now?" Zyra hesitated. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Dan caught it. "The Watcher let us go," she said slowly. "But that does not mean we are free." Dan frowned. "What does that mean?" She stood, her movements smooth, but there was a weight to them now. "The Watcher does not bargain lightly. It chose to release us, but we were not meant to survive." She looked around the hangar, her gaze sharp. "That means something changed." Dan glanced at Carson. "You getting any of this?" Carson groaned. Nope. But at this point, I don't care. Dan turned back to Zyra. So what are you saying? That it let us go on purpose? Zyra's crimson eyes darkened. Yes. And that should worry you. Dan had learned to trust his instincts. Right now, his instincts were screaming that Zyra was right. The Vanguard had survived, but something felt wrong. It was subtle, like an itch he couldn't quite scratch, an unease that had settled deep in his bones. And then, his wrist burned. Dan hissed, grabbing at it. The unseen chains were gone, shattered when the Watcher had released them. But now, where they had been, a faint symbol was seared into his skin. A mark. A twisting, shifting pattern that flickered between being there and not, as if it existed in two realities at once. Zyra saw it, and her expression changed. Dan scowled. All right, that look on your face? I don't like it. Zyra stepped closer, studying the mark. Her voice was quiet, almost distant. It left its seal on you. Dan narrowed his eyes. Meaning? She exhaled. You are now bound to the Watcher. You carry its mark. Dan's stomach turned. You're telling me that thing branded me? Zyra hesitated. It is not merely a brand. It is a claim. Dan's blood ran cold. A claim? Zyra's gaze locked onto his. You are no longer just human, Captain. Silence hung between them. Dan clenched his jaw. You know, you could have just said thank you instead of giving me an existential crisis. Carson groaned from behind them. Can we all agree that none of this is okay? Dan ignored him. His heart was pounding, his mind racing. He looked at Zyra, and for the first time, he saw something in her expression he hadn't expected. Not fear, not detachment, but concern. Not for herself, for him. Dan inhaled, steadying himself. So what does this mean for me? Zyra hesitated again. I do not know. She hated saying that. He could tell. Dan exhaled. Great. Zyra studied him for a moment, then, unexpectedly, reached out. Her fingers brushed against his wrist, lightly, barely a touch. But as soon as they made contact, a surge of something powerful rippled through him. Dan's breath hitched, his vision blurred, and then, for just a moment, he saw something else. A vision, a glimpse into something vast and waiting. Stars collapsing. A figure standing at the edge of the void, watching. And beyond it, something rising, something coming. Dan staggered back, gasping. The vision snapped away, the world rushing back into focus. Zyra's hand was still on his wrist. Her expression was tight, troubled. You saw it, she said. It wasn't a question. Dan swallowed hard. What the hell was that? Zyra exhaled. The Watcher did not let us go out of mercy. She met his gaze, her crimson eyes gleaming. It let us go because something worse is coming. Dan's fingers curled into fists. Of course it was. Dan stood in silence, the weight of Zyra's words pressing down on him like the crushing gravity of a collapsed star. Something worse was coming. He flexed his fingers, feeling the strange mark the Watcher had left on his wrist. It wasn't just a scar. It was a link, a tether to something far beyond human understanding. Whatever he had glimpsed in that brief vision, it hadn't been just a warning. It had been a summons. Carson rubbed his temples. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and say it. What the hell are we supposed to do about that? Dan inhaled deeply. His military instinct screamed at him to do something, to assess, to plan, to fight. But how did you fight something you couldn't even comprehend? He looked at Zyra. She was staring at the mark on his wrist with an expression he couldn't quite place. Not fear, not sorrow, but something close to both. You're thinking something, he said. Zyra met his gaze. I am. Want to share? She hesitated. Then, there is one place where we might find answers. Dan frowned. Where? Zyra exhaled. Orithis 9. Dan stiffened. Orithis 9. Her homeworld. A planet shrouded in secrecy, ruled by the exalted. Her people. Dan had never been there. Few humans ever had. And those who had? Most never returned. Carson groaned. Oh great. A secret alien empire that probably wants us dead. That sounds way better than fighting eldritch horrors. Dan ignored him. He kept his focus on Zyra. You think they'll help? he asked. Zyra's gaze darkened. No, but they know more about the Watcher than anyone else. She looked down at his wrist. And if they see that mark on you, they will react. Dan didn't like the way she said that, but he had no better options. He exhaled. All right, Orithis 9 it is. 2 days later, the Vanguard left human-controlled space. Dan stood on the bridge, watching as the stars stretched into long, thin streaks of light. The ship systems had mostly recovered, though some areas still flickered, as if the vessel itself had been touched by something unnatural. Orithis 9 lay ahead, deep within the territory of the Exalted, a place that, by all accounts, he should never go. Zyra stood beside him, silent, her gaze fixed on the void beyond. Dan glanced at her. You okay? She hesitated. Then, I never thought I would return, she admitted. Dan smirked. You and me both. She turned to him then, studying him the way she always did, like she was trying to understand him. And for the first time, she asked, Why did you save me? Dan thought about that. 100 possible answers flashed through his mind. Duty, instinct, stubbornness, the fact that he hated losing. But in the end, he just shrugged. Because you're not as cold-hearted as you pretend to be. Zyra blinked. Then, just for a moment, a small, knowing smile touched her lips. And as the ship hurtled toward Orithis 9, toward unknown dangers and an uncertain fate, Dan knew one thing for sure. Their fight wasn't over. It was just beginning.